Hello, everybody. We are live ahead of qualifying for the Saudi Arabian Grand Prix. And Rob, it has been a busy morning already.
It has been chaos this morning, Adam. I am super excited to get into a lot of the information and data we've learnt from practice. A couple of really interesting developments, which I'm sure a number of you watching are already across the details of. So really fascinated by what that means for our fantasy teams and how that plays into our decision making.
All right, a quick reminder of the ground rules. If you have questions about your overall lineup, make sure you take a screenshot of that team, go over to our base on the FanAmp app, just drop it in, and our producer will put it in a slide deck that we'll share here. And also remember, we have a contest that we'll pick in about 45 minutes, that winner, and we need to answer the question, which driver gets your 2x DRS boost this week? So make sure to answer that question. You'll have a chance to win a great prize from our sponsor at Fifth Gear Garms. Rob, that's a great segue into our first big piece of news today because Carlos Sainz was a really popular 2x DRS boost pick because it allows you to have both the Red Bull and Ferrari constructors. We now know that Carlos is not going to participate in this weekend after an emergency appendectomy. Ali Bearman takes his place. What does that mean for drivers, for players that have Sainz in the 2x spot?
Yeah, I think that is a very easy decision to make. Even if you don't have him in your 2x spot, Carlos Sainz will score 0 for the race weekend. His driver card is no longer in the game and has been replaced by Ollie Bearman. So owners of Carlos Sainz, I would recommend looking at alternative options. You do not receive an auto-replace driver in his place. So think about some options out there. There are a number of them kind of in that price bracket that we would certainly give some serious thought to, but it certainly lessens the appeal of Carlos. As for Ferrari, the constructor in particular, what do you think that means for their owners?
It's been a very interesting morning as we try to unpack what this means for everybody. Just to recap a few of the things that Rob said there, you're not going to get the automatic substitution like we did back in 2022 when Albon was the last driver to have the appendicitis. So you need to make sure that you have a transfer ready to pull Sainz out. And apologies to anybody who's already made their 2 transfers to this week and still have Sainz in their lineup because you're going to have to take the 10-point hit to get him out. Now, with Bearman coming in at 14 million, it's an intriguing option because he's coming in cheaper than Fernando Alonso in a much faster car, but he has to come to grips with it really quickly. And when we think about drivers that have come in a pinch, these last few injuries, thinking about Liam Lawson coming in for Daniel Ricciardo last year, he finished P13 in an inferior AlphaTauri. And then there was the Alex Albon appendicitis 2 years ago. We had Nick DeVries come in for him and he finished P9. So first-time drivers tend to fare well in their first race, but this is also a particularly tricky track to start your F1 career.
Yeah, definitely. And for those that were paying close attention in FP3, Bearman ran off the track. I think it was around turn 22 or thereabouts, and obviously didn't affect the car whatsoever, but it just goes to show how tricky of a circuit Saudi Arabia is. And there has been a bit of talk in the lead up to this race, as there is most seasons, around how fast paced it is, how some of these corners are quite difficult to navigate. I think for a driver like Bearman, I would proceed with caution, and I know some people have obviously remain quite bullish on him and his fantasy stock, particularly at 14 million. But it is a very difficult price point to accommodate in our fantasy teams. And I'd be very surprised if people are able to incorporate him into their lineups without also taking a hit in other parts of their team too, particularly the constructor.
The other big news from FP3 was a big shunt from Zhou Guanyu. We love him on this show because he's so great with his overtaking ability, but now his status for qualifying's up in the air. I see a lot of questions in the chat already asking about Zhou. We're going to keep a close eye on this to see if they can get a car ready for qualifying. But basically the options are if they take a spare car or they can fix the car that was damaged during FP3, he can qualify. But if they can't get it ready in time, he wouldn't classify for qualifying and take a minus 5-point penalty that he'd have to overcome with overtakes in the race. So the range of outcomes for Zhou are pretty wide.
Yeah, definitely. I think it is a very difficult situation for owners of Zhou and Ferrari because it is essentially wiping 2 trades off the board, where a lot of people want to carry an additional one into Australia for that flexibility where we have a bit more information on the template. It is very much still up in the air as to which 2 constructor pairs are the best to run with as it stands. So I mean, if I was in that situation, I'd probably prioritize, if you're looking to move out Ferrari, that one, because I think Joe, a -5 is not the end of the world. I think even if he does start at the back of the grid, we know how capable he is with racking up those overtakes. So even if he does start with a deficiency in his points bank, I don't think it's the end of the world. I think there's probably other parts, other fires that maybe other strategists could prioritize over that.
That sounds good. You can see Rob has the FP3 result, or I guess all of the free practice results up on the screen here. Ollie Bearman, in his first practice session of the year, finished in P10. And I think this is good news for all of the drivers north of him. Both Mercedes, both McLarens, and possibly even both Aston Martins now in a safer position to score points in this race. Rob, what do you see as the fantasy prospects of those other constructors?
I think it certainly increases the appeal of Mercedes. And don't let me say, I don't think Bearman completely ruins the appeal of Ferrari. I still think they will be a solid outfit this weekend, but I expect that Red Bull, Mercedes, and McLaren, and maybe even Aston Martin too, could score higher than them. Aston Martin in particular have looked very strong, I thought, through all three practice sessions. And I know there are maybe some concerns around their race pace, but at the same time, we saw a really good drive from Lance Stroll last week after being spun out or got caught up in that mess on that first turn in Bahrain. And Fernando Alonso, even though he did finish P9, he did as much as he could with that car and has looked very good through all three practice sessions. So I know there may be some concern around their race pace, but, you know, given that the top 5 is pretty much locked in at the moment, I really can't see either of them falling out of the points unless there was something unforeseen.
There's going to be a lot of interesting lineup decisions because we had a few key constructor combinations that succeeded last week. There was Ferrari Mercedes, Ferrari Red Bull, depending on what you did with your 2X spot. Rob, you and I both ran Red Bull RB, and with only 2 free moves, we have a lot of options, because even though Red Bull RB aren't the best constructor pairing, there is some intrigue about having an additional free transfer for Australia to get things totally right without taking the penalty.
Yeah. So it's lots to think about. What's your take on Mercedes? And I guess I ask you as a Mercedes fan. You're kitted out in their gear on the stream, but you know we probably didn't see a lot from them in Bahrain, and with maybe Ferrari taking a step back with Sainz out this weekend. What do you think this weekend looks like for them, particularly after last week's struggles?
I think the most likely outcome for Mercedes, if you look at the top few, you'll have 2 Red Bulls in or around the podium positions with Charles Leclerc right behind. And then I think they'll be in a battle with Lando and Fernando for that 4th, 5th, 6th, 7th area. So if you take that constructor, you have 2 very secure assets at the top of the grid. If you had the Ferrari Mercedes combination last week, I think it would be too much movement to get out of Ferrari and Mercedes, find a new 2X driver. So I would hold station with that group, considering how well Charles and the 2 Mercedes are looking. Indeed. Do we want to quickly pick up some of the messages in the chat, ask a few questions before we get into a couple of team lineups and Terry a bit later on? There are a lot of questions about Ferrari and Zhou. I think we've muscled through most of them. Leapsfrog says he's going 2X Bearman. I would love to see a screenshot of that, and I'll be keeping my fingers and toes crossed for you if you do. All right. So there's the question from Derpy Cake, and this is something that I was struggling with as I set my lineup this week. Should I swap out Ricciardo for Zhou? So the thought here is a little extra budget. Zhou potentially with some overtake in his future. What do you think about that, Rob? Yeah, it's a tough one. I think if you're taking a -10, I would avoid taking a -10 for any budget driver, to be quite honest. I just don't think there's the points potential there. For Zhou, if we put the potential -5 aside, I do think longer term that would still pay off if you're replacing him over Ricciardo. I just haven't really been encouraged by the RB at all, and I know both you and I have the RB in that second constructor slot.
my likely move this week will be to move out Daniel Ricciardo to give me a bit more budget flexibility heading into Australia. And I think Zhou is a really safe bet, -5, potential -5 aside. I think we've got that overtake upside. The positions gained. He isn't known as a particularly strong qualifier, so I think that qualifying ceiling isn't very high for him. And I think just having a little bit more budget heading into the third race week is going to provide a lot of us with flexibility to maneuver our lineups as we see fit once we have a much clearer idea of what meta lineups are going to look like. What about you?
You bring up a good point about over-indexing on RB. For those of us that have Ricardo and the RB constructor, they haven't shown us a lot to be really excited about. In about 10 minutes, we're going to have Terry on to talk about some of the upgrades for this weekend and what he saw of those upgrades and what do the short-term prospects look like for RB. So I'm excited to talk to him about that.
Another thing I want to actually get your thoughts on is the no negative chip. Mike's mentioned it in the chat, and it has been something talked about a little bit given this difficulty of Saudi Arabia, that street circuit nature. But last season we saw, and in 2022 as well, the race organizers roll out a few additional safety measures to improve kind of some of the turns and the speeds through parts of the track. What do you think the no negative chip means for strategists heading into Saudi Arabia, and if it's worthwhile using now or saving for later?
I've been giving the advice this morning to hold the no negative for now. And it's going to require some antacids to get through this weekend because I think we're going to have some bumps. But the no negative chip for me makes more sense a little bit later in the year. We found that the DNF rate went up in the second half of the year as temperatures get hotter and car parts start breaking down. So I would prefer it there. It's very hard to put your finger on these early season big DNF races. So 2 years ago, it was this race, but then there were only 2 DNFs last season. Last season, it was Australia. It was the big DNF race. Remember, we had the 8 DNFs, and there were these 3 crashes in the last 5 laps. So it's hard to predict these outlier things. And I'm confident about some of those extra safety precautions you mentioned, Rob. So I would recommend holding.
Yep.
Leaps Frog asks, is Logan Sargent qualifying? So Logan punctured a tire in FP3. It didn't look like really bad damage. They just held him out of the rest of the session. I haven't heard anything that would give me reason to believe he's not qualifying, but we'll keep a close eye on it.
Yep. I think Logan Sargent for me is still very much an avoid. He made it through relatively unscathed last year, but he has had a couple of moments through practice, and I'm just not sure at a track like this, which cannot be too forgiving, whether Logan Sargent's someone I want to go near at this point in the season.
All right, a couple of more things in the chat as we prepare for Terry in just a few minutes. Big Man Rayezo says, should I take a risk by taking Bearman or both the Red Bull and Aston Martin as constructors? If you're ever in between having one good driver or 2 really good constructors, I always lean to other constructors. And even though Bearman's in a Ferrari, I don't want to put too much stake in someone's first race because it could go poorly, depending on how adapted to the car he is.
Yep.
Would you agree, Rob?
Yes. Yeah. 100%. It is some. I mean, I've always been very reluctant to go with someone that's probably a little untested and unproven. So, very much aligned on that. Should we take a look at a couple of lineups before we bring Terry in?
Let's do it.
And give some.
While you bring that up, Rob, our friend Tom from Pop Man F1 says, my advice to you all: panic.
Oh, I'm panicking, Tom. Don't you worry. I'm panicking regardless of whether my trades are locked in or not. So that's just the life of a fantasy strategist. I think the first team we've got this week, and remember to submit, as you can see on the screen here, your teams to our fantasy formula based on FanAmp to get your lineup reviewed. This first team is from Canadian Wolves. So thank you for submitting that team. We've got a Max Verstappen, Mercedes, and Ferrari combination here with budget fodder littered throughout. I think my initial thoughts are I'm pretty content with this lineup, Ferrari, Mercedes, and Verstappen. And I know we've maybe been a little bit pessimistic on Bearman, but when you're looking at that double RB lineup, which didn't instill a lot of confidence with us in Bahrain, I'd probably be looking at one of those two as the make way this week.
I agree. And particularly if you've already made your 2 free transfers, this is basically the team you're looking at. So I wouldn't recommend taking a penalty at this point for moving them in. I like the combination of Max, Mercedes, Ferrari. So basically the rest you're just rolling the dice and hoping for the best.
Yep. Next one of the classic team names I've seen going around lately, Bottas, and you can see the rest of that. But this one, no Red Bull coverage. Leclerc and Hamilton as the two powerhouse drivers here. Alonso as well, with Mercedes and RB as the two constructors. What's your initial take on this team? Bit different.
I'm a little nervous about this team because it's driver heavy and a little bit softer on the constructors. Remember, this is a race that Sergio Perez won last year. Max Verstappen led all drivers with 61 points because he qualified P15, muscled his way all the way back to P2, got a fastest lap in the driver of the day for his efforts too. Red Bull are going to come out great in this race. So I would want a little bit more coverage of them than this.
Yep. I think so. Otherwise, I can't really fault Albon and Alonso. I like both of those picks as fantasy assets. Now, Joe submitted his lineup, and he's curious to get our opinion on which trade he should make this week. I really like the Ferrari Red Bull double up. I would say maybe Perez is potentially an option here, or Ricciardo is maybe an alternative of my two standouts.
I'm actually okay with this lineup because here you have Red Bull and Ferrari as really good constructor options. Leclerc is, I think, a P2, P3 finisher in this race, could get driver of the day just due to his popularity. And folks want to see some changes in the podium positions. So I like that as the 2X driver. And then Lance Stroll could be a beneficiary of Ollie Bearman being on the grid. He was just inside the top 10 after getting spun out on the opening lap last week. He could be a lock for P8 to P10 and another points finish for him. So I like that number 1, number 2 driver situation and still having really good constructors.
Yeah, I really like the Stroll pick, and I'm going to roll with Stroll this week as well. But the one thing I would think about for strategists making a trade or two this week is what and how you want to tackle your lineup in Australia. I think for a team like this, where you're quite nicely set up with Red Bull and Ferrari, or even the Mercedes Ferrari combination, is you're probably less pressed to make a constructor transfer this week. So maybe the intention of rolling a transfer is less of a priority. But I think if you're stuck with an Alpine and RB, or maybe even an Aston Martin, how you want to tackle Australia with getting that 2 premium constructor lineup. Whether you just make one trade, roll the other one, or you take 2 now if you think that Ferrari, for instance, you want in your team longer term.
Rob, the chat's got a lot of activity, so I want to just rapid fire a couple of quick questions to you. Magnussen or Bottas?
I like Magnussen. I think he will qualify quite low, and that Haas race pace is particularly encouraging. So I'm taking Magnussen.
I just realized I Americanized the heck out of our favorite Finn, Bottas. I'm practicing. I would still pick Magnussen for the same reasons you said. I think Haas are working on their race pace and not dropping off, and it was very encouraging for what we saw from K-Mag last week, so I would hold on to K-Mag. Bob had asked, would you take a -10? If you have Sainz, absolutely take a -10. I'm tending to be more conservative with my lineup. If you can take just one transfer into next week and sort your team, then just have a good enough team to get by this week. That's the approach you'll probably see me take this week. Jacob Freeman asked, should I keep Zhou? If the first few minutes of this chat is any indication, Rob, I think you and I are on opposite sides of the fence on should I keep Zhou. You see the upside of the overtakes early in the race. I'm focusing more on the pessimistic side that potentially he doesn't participate in qualifying, takes a -5. Maybe he has to start from the pit lane so he doesn't get overtakes on the start. So I'm more pessimistic on Zhou, but that is just a gut feeling.
I think the one thing I will say is if you've got more pressing matters in your team to address, like Sainz, for instance, then I would say Zhou is less of a priority. But if you're pretty content and well set up with your team, and Zhou seems to be the glaring deficiency in your lineup, then I'd agree with you. I think he maybe needs to be swapped out, but I think it is, as cliche as the expression is, team dependent.
All right, let's do maybe one more. What are your thoughts on Tsunoda if you're thinking of pulling out Ricciardo?
It's a toss-up.
Tsunoda gives you a little bit more budget flexibility to use with your transfers ahead of Australia next week, but you might want Ricciardo in your lineup in his home race next week because he does tend to have a little extra mojo at home. So I think this is a bit of a toss-up. And certainly we need to make sure that those team order issues from last week are behind them and that they're willing to cooperate this week.
Okay, cool. Let's look at Mike's team and then we'll get the great man Terry in.
Let's do it.
So Mike, I feel like Mike's team is etched into my brain, given I see it a little bit on Twitter as well. But he's got the Max Verstappen, Mercedes, and Ferrari threemium in this team, and then you've got the RB drivers Zhou and Albon. My initial thoughts are probably one of the RB drivers or Zhou, depending on how optimistic / pessimistic you are on the Sauber.
Agreed. Keep Max in those constructors. Go with your gut on one move for the budget drivers. Make sure with a lineup this strong, make sure you're taking a free transfer into next week.
I'm thinking Ricciardo is probably, if I had to choose between Yuki and Ricciardo, I'm probably getting rid of Ricciardo just because he's slightly dearer and means you've got a bit more financial flexibility heading into Australia, like you say.
The writer simulation on F1 Fantasy Tools agrees.
Yep.
For what that's worth.
Cool.
All right. Time to bring on our usual guest. You know him from F1 Coffee Corner and the Tech Corner articles on the FanAmp website. Terry, welcome back.
Good afternoon. Well, it's afternoon for me. Is it morning for you guys? I can never work this one out.
Still morning for a little while.
Still morning.
Terry, let's get started with the big news of the week. Ollie Bearman coming into the Ferrari to replace Carlos Sainz. What did you see from FP3, and what do you think Bearman's prospects are in his first race?
It's really hard to call. I mean, he looked comfortable as you can be jumping from F2 to F1 in Saudi Arabia. He put in, 20-odd laps, I think it was, 22 laps. So he got some good running in. The Ferrari is going to be competitive around here. It is a gamble. He hasn't got the experience of driving in Formula 1. Is that going to play a factor? I think the car and the ability is certainly there, but it's whether or not he can keep out of trouble, get some laps behind him, and actually, produce a good qualifying result, and then obviously into the race tomorrow. So I do think it is a gamble. I don't think that there's anything to do with the Ferrari. The pace looks good, but I think it's whether or not something else might sort of play a factor in this one.
The last two stand-in rookie moments are De Vries and last year with Liam Lawson. Did they set the bar too high for Bearman this week, or is contending for points and perhaps a little bit better because he's in a Ferrari? Is that a reasonable expectation for him?
I think because it's Ferrari, isn't it? Let's be honest. That's where the expectation is. That's what's hyping everything up. And like we said, it is a competitive Ferrari. We've seen Charles's times, they're competitive. Even Carlos, even though he was struggling, was setting competitive times. So that Ferrari does look good around this track. It's built for a track like this. So I think the expectation is going to be there. It's the thing about rookies, they have no fear. He's got an opportunity to prove himself. And actually, that's a massive advantage for maybe backing him, because this is his chance to put himself in a window. We know he's been talking about driving for Haas next year. We know he's been talking about him wanting a Formula 1 drive. This is his opportunity to shine, and he's going to be grasping it with both hands, which actually could play into, it could go either way, couldn't it? It could involve something a bit risky, which backfires on a track like this, which is unforgiving, or actually it could be an absolutely barnstorming performance in a car that can potentially get a podium.
If he does well in this stretch, filling in for Sainz, it's going to make silly season a complete mess, like you had indicated a moment ago. Puts another talented rookie driver in the pool. I can't wait to see it.
Oh, it's going to be exciting, if nothing else. I mean, it is the ultimate intrigue, isn't it? Let's be honest. It's, someone who's unproven, but has got that potential in a car that can actually deliver something. He's just, it's a mouth-watering sort of scenario from that point of view.
For a driver that has obviously come through the Haas team as well, I'm quite fascinated by Hülkenberg and Magnussen this weekend, particularly because of that improved race pace we saw from them in Bahrain. Interestingly, outside of Sargent, they are the two lowest projected fantasy scoring drivers in F1 Fantasy Tools simulations for this week. What's your take on Haas as a team generally, and what their prospects could be for fantasy this week, Terry?
I've got them above Sauber and Alpine. So I've got them in that. There's a sort of a Williams, there's a Racing Bulls, there's a Haas sort of pool, I'd say, and I've got them in that, just slightly ahead of both the Saubers and obviously the Alpines, who are going to really struggle around here. So I think that might be being a bit harsh. I think they've done some work on that tyre deck. I think the work and the parts they're taking from Ferrari is clearly helping them. And we know that they proved last week with the 1 lap pace with Hulkenberg can qualify, and actually they can qualify quite well. So I think that might be being a bit harsh. I'd certainly have them over the state drivers at the moment, and certainly over any Alpine bets, that's for sure.
Yeah, I'm really liking Magnussen as a fantasy asset because of his likely ability to qualify slightly lower than his teammate Hulkenberg, who we know is a Q3 merchant on some days. And so I think for a driver like Magnussen, even though he did have a solid fantasy race last week, he does kind of have a little bit more upside, I think, in making a few more passes on track and moving from, say, what he might qualify in a P17 to finishing the race around P10, P11, P12 type thing.
Yeah, I think ultimately, Hulkenberg would always sort of fall backwards from qualifying. Magnussen's got the potential to get the overtakes and the points and go forward, definitely.
As you guys were chatting, we just wrapped up a poll in the chat. Where do you think Bearman finishes qualifying? 63% of respondents said P6 to P10, which is where he ended up in FP3, followed by P11 to P15. That was 31%. So looks like everyone's expecting a upper middle of the pack qualifying for the rookie, which is great.
Yeah.
Terry, as I'm looking for some optimism as someone who's running RB, can you give my fellow RB enthusiasts some news about their upgrades, what you've seen so far, and perhaps any good news as we look ahead to this week for them?
I'll try is probably the answer. So the upgrades they brought a track-specific rear wing, and they've also brought a new front wing to balance that out. And they've also done a slight modification to the engine coat cover and the side pods on there to make it a bit more streamlined. So they have tried. I think their gains have been quite minimal from what I've seen so far. And it doesn't look like from the projection over the long since they did that they're going to have a huge amount of pace in terms of troubling, the Aston Martins, the McLarens and the higher up team. So I think it's a case of, like I said, that there seems to be this group, this alongside Haas, where they're in that pack, where I don't think they're going to have enough performance to break into the top, unless, of course, there's a safety car and an incident that puts them there. But looking on their raw pace, I'm like you, I've got them in my team, and I'm struggling to find a way to project them into the sort of top 10 unless something happens where they pass in there or they get a good qualifying, which puts them in there.
Do you think as well that one driver in particular looks any better than the other? Because I know they finished right next to one another in the race last week, and aside from FP1 in Bahrain as well, there's been nothing since then to get inspired by Ricciardo or Tsunoda. And I look at each of them, practice by practice, and they just seem to be rubber banding in the rankings. So is there one driver in particular that you think stands out for you at the moment, or is it quite even?
No, I think they're fairly even. I think, like you say, that they're quite similar in terms of their pace. They're quite similar in terms of their times. Not one of them is sending out to the point where I'd, put your flag in the sand and say go that way or the other. I think they're going to be the same this weekend. They're going to be quite close together again. It should make for good, interesting team radio, but maybe not for picking a driver.
Terry, the other team that is definitely looking to get out of the bottom is Alpine. I didn't see anything from free practice that made me overly optimistic, and certainly there's just so much turnover in the technical leadership of that team. Did you see anything optimistic for Alpine, or do you think they'll still toil in the bottom 5 this week?
No, I think they're toil on bottom of the pack, because ultimately they haven't brought any upgrades. It's the same car that was in Bahrain. They literally had 0 upgrades. We know that their engine power is down anyway. They're suffering 30 brake horsepower before the season even started. And they haven't got the aerodynamic capability at the moment to get it back up in the corners. So they lose on the corners, lose on the straight. So they're definitely a team to avoid around here, unfortunately. Whether or not sort of going forward, they might be able to bring some upgrades. But certainly with what we're seeing, there's nothing which is suggesting that they're going to be anywhere bar towards the back of the pack, unfortunately.
It's a shame, given that there was maybe a little bit of optimism heading into the season for Alpine, but if the first race has taught us anything, those guys are going to be back of the pack. I think the one thing in favor of Alpine drivers in terms of fantasy performance anyway is obviously their poor qualifying that we're probably going to expect from them. And as long as they avoid any carnage ahead of them and can get to the end of the race, which last season was a bit of a question mark given Ocon's DNF rate. I don't think Gasly and Ocon are terrible options fantasy wise. I just wonder if over an entire race they're going to make more than a few positions up.
Yeah. I'm not sure. I mean, they got the driver ability. I'm not sure they got the car, which can get their positions. You know, maybe they need to borrow Jeremy Clarkson's tractor. I don't know. Maybe that's an answer.
So Jeremy Clarkson's been the kiss of death when he visits these garages, right? Because I thought I saw him with Red Bull last week, and then I kept my fingers and toes crossed ever since.
I think he might be the new Nico Rosberg in terms of the curse. We could be getting the curse of Jeremy Clarkson instead this season.
There were teams trying to send Nico to Red Bull all season last year.
Yeah,
and he was playing along.
And it'd be Jeremy Clarkson this year.
That's fantastic. Terry, what is your team shaping up as? You had hinted at a couple of assets, but is there any tips and tricks you can give our viewers?
I've stayed with Ferrari. I can't seem to move out the Red Bulls, so I've got Ferrari. Then let me put it back up actually, because this week I've been a lot better and actually submitted it beforehand, not left it to last minute and chucked it in there. So I've got my banking on Max, I'm afraid to say, because I can't see anything past that one. And then I've got my Ferrari and RB, got Ricciardo, I've got Alonso in there, Albon, Max, Yuki. So I'm kind of stuck in that RB mode, which is more budget than anything else, unfortunately. But I do think that the Ferrari Max will do well, and then I think Fernando's going to do well around here as well.
Good. Well, I'll tease for people watching that I've already made my trade for this week, and I think we'll get to our teams a little bit later in the video. But one of Ricciardo and the RB Constructor is on the way out for me this week. If you're not following along so far. So, Adam, any point of view on what your thoughts on RB are this week, or?
I'll tell you, I'm not super optimistic about them, but I am also a bit stuck because they give me the lineup flexibility to keep Max and Red Bull in with Stroll, who I think has higher upside now with the Ollie Bearman news. So I'm leaning toward keeping RB, taking my lumps, and then having 3 free transfers in Australia to make the move properly. Nice. Because when I line up my starting team with all the top teams from F1 Fantasy Tools, there are teams that will score more, but I need to burn my transfers or take a -10 to get maybe an extra 10 or 15 points. I think I'd rather just hold on to it and really optimize my team in 2 weeks.
Great strategy. Maybe we could pick a couple of questions out in the chat and get Terry to answer, given
probably some Mercedes questions, because that's a real interesting proposition, that lineup.
Let's see. I'm not sure where we got up to in the chat, Adam, and knowing me, I've probably lost
I'm doing my damnedest to pull double duty in the chat while you two chat. So feel free to start in the upper middle.
Do we want to talk about Mercedes for a minute? Because they're running 2 very different setups. I could talk about
Mercedes all day. Let's do it, Terry.
I know. But they are running 2 very different setups, actually. So Lewis has gone for a much more higher downforce wing in FP3 than what George has got, which is on the back of that spin that we saw Lewis take yesterday. So that's going to give him lower top speed, but potentially better tyre management. However, George is obviously looking faster out the 2. So it's a real intriguing proposition to which one of those 2 Mercedes drivers has actually got it right. George certainly looks much more comfortable around here. He looks like the low drag downforce wing that was made for here suits George very well. Lewis is clearly having problems with it in terms of, holding on to that rear end, that stability, just not feeling happy with it. So he's swapped it. I'm guessing by the fact he did it in FP3, he might even keep that one for qualifying because it's a bit late in the day to be changed it back. So I do think there's 2 very different propositions for Mercedes this weekend, based on that alone, just looking at the data from those 2.
Do you think as well, if you've got hypothetically a team with Ferrari, obviously as a constructor in that team, that Mercedes is more appealing? Terry, I know I don't want to get you too caught up in the semantics of fantasy point scoring, but if you're looking as like a Leclerc Bearman versus a Hamilton Russell, I think Ferrari seem to have the race pace. But do you think that Bearman rookie on a difficult circuit maybe instills a bit of cause for concern?
That's the risk. I think George will perform better than Lewis from what I'm seeing, but I still think a bad performing Lewis is probably going to still get high enough in the points. I saw all the questions there about McLaren, which I think was Ollie Birch said that about McLaren having something up their sleeves. They actually haven't. There's a lot of talk that McLaren is sandbagging. They're not. They're running a much higher downforce on their rear wing, which is a new rear wing they introduced this weekend. So what you're seeing is the pace of McLaren. They're not actually sandbagging ready for qualifying. So got to be aware of that one, which makes them think I don't think they've got enough to break into that Ferrari and that Mercedes category. So I think you've got Red Bull are going to be on their own towards the front, which I know that Adam talked about Checo last year and the performance there. I think you've then got very close between what looks like it's going to be Leclerc and George. And then the Aston Martin McLaren sort of is going to come in, because Aston Martin is saying they're carrying quite a bit of a dragster around here. Fernando's performed well, but his engine mode did look turned up yesterday, right to the max, which makes you think that they didn't make any gains in pace today. Whereas Ferrari, we saw in FP3 made a big jump in terms of their pace when they turned that engine up. So I think that might see Aston Martin just drop down a bit. I think we've seen in their long run yesterday that they're not quite going to have enough yet.
Okay.
That's throwing some more questions in the mix. I like everyone's going mad in the chat now.
I'm going mad keeping up with the chat. This has been great.
That's it. Screw out the team.
Let's see. Terry, have you heard anything new just in the last 30 minutes or so about the prospects of Zhou or Sargent suiting up for qualifying?
From what I can see, Sargent's not a problem. I'm not hearing that they've got a major problem with Williams, so he should be fine. With Joe, I think they look like they're getting the spare car ready. We talked about this before we came on air. There's been nothing from them yet. The only thing I do worry about, with their performance looking like it is, are they going to rush to get him into qualifying, or are they actually going to leave it in the sense of starting him from the pit lane anyway? Which would be my only concern. And in terms of making up places, we're only in race 2, so his engine performance isn't going to be that great because we haven't seen much engine wear on the cars. We expect once we get to sort of 5 or 6 races, we've seen engines turn down, they're managing a bit more. Race 2, you kind of think that he's not going to get a big bump from that Ferrari engine that's in it to sort of make his way through the pack. And we're expecting him to be towards the back anyway, so they might just take the hit on it and start him from the pit lane based on that if they can't get it ready in time. But I know they're trying because everyone wants to qualify, don't they? So ultimately, there'd be nothing through lack of trying, and it is a spare car to get ready, but it could be a case of it's come too soon.
Fair enough.
All right, we'll continue to monitor it in the next few minutes here. Terry, any final thoughts for this week before we go back to lineup reviews? I
don't think we're going to get a problem with Mercedes cooling like we had last week. They didn't bring an upgrade, but what they did do, they uncovered the vents. So what they did last week is on the Thursday, they had the vents uncovered, which gave them performance. Then their data led them to believe they could cover it up for all of qualifying in the race, which is what they did. They covered up some of the vents because obviously, more vents you got, more drag you got, the more you compromise your speed. What they're doing this week, it looks quite clear. They're not even attempting to cover those up. So I don't think we're going to get an engine cooling problem like we had in Bahrain. So even though they haven't brought an upgrade for it, they brought a fix for it, is probably what I would say. I don't think it's going to be a factor from what we're seeing.
Okay.
Well, Terry, thank you so much for coming on again. For anyone who hasn't followed Terry already, he's at F1 Coffee Corner anywhere you're on social media. And he also writes the Tech Corner article on fanamp.com every week. And it's one of my favorite reads. Terry, thank you so much for coming on.
No problem. I'll drop in the chat if anyone's got any questions as well. So if anyone's got any, drop in the chat and I'll make sure.
Terry, you owe the chat an answer about your feelings on avocado toast from last week.
I haven't tried it. I mean, I'm ashamed to say, not even avocado. So it'd probably go well with that steak, F1 top, but I'm going to have to try it and get back in the chat before we head to Australia, just so I can actually give them a solid answer on what it tastes like.
You do avocado toast, Terry, and I'll do Vegemite, even though I love my Vegemite. But a lot of people have strong
if you do that, we do that before we head to Australia. You might have to try that. It's 4 a.m. I think for me for Australia. So might have to try avocado and toast to stay awake.
That could be the Australian. Well, I guess Australians already have their shoey, but that could be the additional thing we do is non-Australians try the Vegemite for the first time. It is an acquired taste.
Ooh.
Dinner and a show on stream.
Yeah.
Well, great. Thanks for dropping by, Terry. I always appreciate your insights. They're super valuable for all of us.
Thank you, guys. Hope that helped.
It always does.
All right. I think we rapid fire, let's say 4 or 5 lineups quickly, get back to the chat and then lock in our lineups if we haven't done so already. Wink, wink.
Sounds good.
Okay, this team is from... Pardon me?
I'm going to hit the button to lock in my lineup so I don't do anything stupid.
This team is from Alexa It looks as though the proposed 2 trades here is a Stroll RB swap for Sargent and Aston Martin. Now, my initial thoughts are Sargent scares me at Saudi Arabia, but is that enough to deter you from going for a team like Aston Martin, where you've got Alonso's upside and then Bearman, who may probably mean the Aston Martin finishes a little higher in the points? It's daring, but I think it could pay off.
So I had this exact choice going into this week, and you'll see in a moment I opted not to do it, but F1 Fantasy Tools and the Rider Simulation disagree, and they do prefer this lineup. For me, I think it just comes down to just no appetite to run Logan on my team until he can prove he can stay on track. He had that issue in FP3 where he touched the wall, had the flat. I think it's an easy track to have a mistake and ruin your day. So as fast as the Williams looked in free practice, I'm just leaning on the side of caution to keep the, holding station with Stroll and RB and then carrying that extra transfer. That was the straw that broke the camel's back for me.
Yep. I like that a lot. Okay. Hang on. I think I missed one. Big guy. He or she. I really like this team, actually. Like Sonoda or Zhou, I think you could maybe pivot to a Haas driver for. If you're confident that Zhou's not going to make up that 5-point deficiency, then I'd say I like a Magnussen potentially, or even a Hulkenberg in that Zhou slot.
Yeah, I can see they have 2 of 2 free transfers left. I would probably move one Sauber out just to spread that love around a little bit. But to start the week with Max, Red Bull, Aston Martin, and then only make one move and carry a free transfer, I think that's the best of all worlds.
Yep. Leapsfrog, who has been very active in the chat today, has boldly DRS boosted Ollie Bearman. Now that could pay off or it could backfire, and I'm not sure I've got the minerals to take a punt like that. But it is a lot of Ferrari coverage, and if you think they're going to chase that upside with how good they've looked through practice, then I think Ferrari is a shout. I'm just not sure I've got the willingness to go that far with Ollie Bearman.
I appreciate Leap putting their money where their mouth is. So thank you, Leap. I hope Ollie Bearman really surprises us this week and at least gets a big budget boost for you.
Awesome. Let's do 1 or 2 more, and then we can quickly cover off the chat and lock in our lineups. Take me away with this one, Adam. What's your take on this team?
All right, let's unpack. We've got Perez in the 2X spot with Ferrari and Red Bull. Thank you, Rob, making that bigger for my eyes there. And it looks like this is their team 1, so they're looking at 2 different options for it. So option 1 is Ferrari, Red Bull. The other looks like maybe just a 1-for-1 swap to Mercedes.
Yeah.
Ooh. I think because of Leclerc's upside and Bearman's high floor, I would still roll with Ferrari, but it's close enough to be a discussion.
Let's. I think that's an interesting discussion. I'd like to just pivot quickly across to F1 Fantasy Tools, because if we look at their simulations for this week, Ferrari and Mercedes are pretty much neck and neck in terms of what their points projection is. So even if it is only 0.6 separating them, the points difference is minimal, and the price increase change is also not much either.
So it is close enough to be a coin flip. I really don't agree with some of those Red Bull McLaren builds, though.
Yeah, I'm really fascinated by McLaren. I'm just not sure the value's still quite there yet. I need to see a couple more drops for me to entertain their Constructor or Orlando Norris. But it's a tight one on Ferrari and Mercedes. I think it really depends on how optimistic you are or pessimistic you are on 1 or 2 of the teams. Okay.
Rob, I have submitted my lineup. Do you want to start the grand reveal?
Yes. How can I? Do you want to do? Should I go find you on Twitter for?
Sure. Yeah. Feel free to do that.
Let's go here.
And I can do a nice long walk through my team while you finalize and bring it up.
Okay. So Adam, take us away with your team here.
So this is the team from last week, with the one change that I'm feeling in my gut, moving Zhou out for Bottas. It's really just a concern over whether Zhou can qualify, and does he have to start from the pit lane? Can he overcome all of that in potentially a new car? I just got a little bit more of a gut feeling that Valtteri is going to have a better week, but it's not more than that. Meanwhile, like I've been harping on for the full hour here, the ability to bring a third transfer into Australia is going to allow me to properly pivot if moving Stroll and RB out for an Aston Martin, for Ferrari with Perez as the 2x DRS boost. I think it's going to give me that flexibility. And so I also got myself an extra $1 million for my credit, make that lineup shuffling a little bit easier for next week.
Nice. That was the same approach I had coming into this week as well. And I'll come over to my profile to do my team reveal. I this week moved out Daniel Ricciardo for Kevin Magnussen. And I think we have had probably a little bit of overexposure to Ricciardo, RB, I mean to say, the last couple of weeks, which may have backfired just a little bit. And so I'm going for a driver in Kevin Magnussen, who I don't see qualifies all that well week to week. I really don't see him in Q3 whatsoever, even though his teammate perhaps has a little bit of that likelihood. And so I'm going for a driver that probably will go out in Q1, probably, or maybe even Q2, based on some of the practice times we saw from him. Hoping to see a few overtakes and positions gained. The Haas is projected P6 in race pace among all 10 constructors. So I'm, again, much like you, just making one trade, getting a little bit of budget flexibility to ensure that I'm able to capitalize on a RB and Stroll transfer out the following week in favor of a Ferrari or a Mercedes or whatever the medal lineup will be in 2 weeks' time.
Excellent. Now we have just 5 minutes left for the contest. I've been hyping it up in the chat, but do feel free to head over to the FanAmp app, head over to the Fantasy Formula Base. Tell us which driver you're running as your 2X driver this week. Make sure you get a chance to enter the contest because we'll be drawing in 4 minutes. Rob, you want to spend 4 minutes just muscling through the rest of the submitted lineups?
Yep. Great idea. We've got 4 more to get through. I think we've looked at a team quite similar to this already. I think if you had to make a trade, does it look like? It looks like there's 0 out of 2. I think this person has already made
their bed, and they just want us to tell them how they did.
I personally don't mind it at all. I think the double up on Ferrari, if Leclerc is in position for a top 3, that driver of the day nomination potential, that could work wonders. Let's just hope. For all of our sakes that own RB, that they can get their act together just a little bit.
Yep, you can see I've doubled down on Ricciardo and RB this week, so we just need to keep him on the track, maybe get a handful of points so we don't suffer there. I'm happy with this team the rest of the way.
Cool. I think this team the zoom out is probably not sim on the pace. Looks as though the team on the left is taking a -10. Okay. I'm interpreting this as, what's better, team on the left with a -10 or team on the right? I think you're on mute.
Can you zoom in a little bit more, Rob?
Got it. Yep.
So Mercedes and Aston Martin versus Red Bull Aston Martin with a -10.
Probably. And Joe is in both, so we can't. It's really Bearman and Mercedes versus Red Bull, Bottas, and a -10.
I am leaning toward give me Max Red Bull with the -10.
Yep. That's my thought too. I just think Red Bull's too good to look past at the moment. Perez, Verstappen look clinical across the board in practice. So even a -10s, I think, Red Bull outscored Mercedes by more than 10 points last week. I think they'll probably do the same again this go around. This one is from TEARC. Maybe I'm not even going to try and guess what that says, but it looks like this person has activated the wild card. I'd like to get your thoughts on a wild card. Using it this early in the season, initial thoughts.
Part of the reason why I'm opposed to using it this early in the season isn't that you have to survive the rest of the year without the chip, but it's that we haven't totally settled into a solid grid order yet. So I would hate to make a ton of moves to chase the flavor of this week, only to realize that we're slightly off on our prediction and maybe it's an Aston Martin Red Bull build that's best, and now you're chasing again next week. So That's why I'm trying to stay in my lane as best as I can and be patient, lose a few
Mm.
points compared to the meta lineups this week, and then settle into something. And then if I'm really wrong, is say 4 or more transfers worth of wrong later in the season, the wild card's there for me.
Yep, I think so too. And if we see a seismic shift in the template like we did last season, I think that's probably going to be another optimal time to deploy that chip. And the last lineup we've got for the day is from Jeremy. Again, thanks to Jeremy, who's very active in the chat and on Twitter. He's got a Ferrari, Mercedes, Verstappen. And Gasly and Magnussen are probably the less template type drivers at the moment. I've gone with Magnussen this week because I think he'll still qualify quite poorly. And I think Alpine, even though they seem to have fallen out of favor at the moment, are likely going to be out in Q1 too. So they do have a little bit of positions gained upside, I think.
Agreed. I think Gasly, after seeing Ocon only score 1 point more than him and get a 0.5 million bump in price, I think he is a candidate to grow in price. So for people on the fence of Gasly, I think it'd be okay to put in. I think his ceiling and floor are both all single digit. So I think he's fine to run there.
Awesome. All right. Well, I think that wraps up our team lineups. Shall we do the contest with 10 minutes remaining and then
let's do it?
Wrap up any last minute questions in the chat. All right. So one more name to add. And I think we've got everyone in to do it. You happy for me to spin the wheel?
Do it. Good luck, everybody. It's looking like D. Bergeron. A new winner. Congratulations to you. We will be in touch to get you your prize. Another lucky winner this week, Rob.
Yeah, I think we've had a new winner almost every week. We've spun the wheel, except for that second week we ever did it, I think. So,
hey, quick shameless plug for Fifth Gear Garms, by the way. They're dropping their 2024 line tomorrow morning. So use Fantasy 10 for 10% off if you want their first batch of RB or Kicksauber gear.
I'd also shout out the new gravel trap graphics prints on their website that I'm a huge fan of. There's just one over my shoulder here of the Ferrari at Monaco. So some really nice prints there. And if apparel is not your cup of tea, then they've got a bunch of really nice photos to obviously take a look at and potentially purchase as well.
Terrific. All right. It looks like the chat is starting to dry up. That means everybody's setting their lineups, settling in. Oh, Caitlin, remind us in the chat, they also have the Red Racer book. So if you want the ABCs of Formula One to teach your kids early, they do have some really nice books there too. Rob, any last thoughts before we go get settled for qualifying?
No, I think we've done our best to answer the chat as much as possible, although it has been rampant today, which is always a good sign. I think it's honestly a bit of a pray and hope for RB this week, given you and I both own them in our lineups. But I think it's a really difficult decision on Constructors, and I will reiterate how great the game is in terms of the state of play at the moment. There's just so much variety everywhere we look, so many decisions that need to be made, and in terms of how we approach our strategy with transfers and chip usage. I'm just really excited. It's a really, really exhilarating fantasy season, and the fact that there's been so many questions on lineup decisions, I think bodes well for the remainder of the year.
Yeah, if you think about where we were last season, just disappointed with the meta of Red Bull and Aston Martin ×3 on all of our teams. It was really slow going up until Canada. So to have this much activity early in the season, it just makes us really lucky to be able to speculate on such a fun game. Well, I think that's all for now. Everybody go get settled. We're going to have a really wild time in qualifying. Best of luck to all of you on your teams. Thanks for watching. We'll see you in 2 weeks for Australia.
Thanks, guys.